On the afternoon of February 17, 1943, soldiers of the German Afrika Korps drove onto an American airfield in central Tunisia called Thalepta and found nobody there. Not a battle. Not a rout. An empty field. The order to clear out had gone down shortly after midnight, and by mid-morning the fighter groups were gone. Aircraft, pilots, ground crews, paperwork. Whatever was still sitting on that field had been left because there was no truck left to put it on. 50 tons of fuel and lubricants, for one thing. In an army that measured its future in gallons, that alone went straight into the day's reports. But the fuel is not what this story is about. Off at the edge of the field stood a truck. 2.5 tons, 6 wheels, all of them driven. Instead of a cargo bed, it carried a box body with doors at the back, and the doors were not locked, because whoever had the key was 40 miles west by then. Inside, a lathe was bolted crossways to the floor, just behind the forward bulkhead. Behind it, a drill press, a bench grinder, welding gear, a generator that ran off the truck's own engine, so the whole shop could work anywhere the truck could reach. In the dark, in a field, in the rain. None of that would have shocked a German ordnance man. The Wehrmacht had workshop trucks, and good ones. German mechanics were, by any honest measure, among the finest in the world, and they had spent 3 years proving it across 2 continents. What was new was at the back. Rows of steel bins, each one stenciled, each one holding a single part, and only that part, in quantity. Gaskets, bearings, fuel pumps, brake cylinders, spark plugs, and fixed inside the door, a book. Page after page of numbers, every part in that truck listed against a code, and the same code stamped on the part itself. I want you to hold on to that. Not the lathe, not the welder, the bins and the book. Because everything that follows in this story comes back to them. Every burning tank dragged off a field in the dark. Every German officer who could not explain what he was looking at. Every argument inside the Reich about why the war was going the way it was going. The men standing at Thalepta that afternoon understood perhaps half of what they were looking at. It would take the German army the better part of 2 years to understand the other half, and by then, understanding it would change nothing. If you want more stories about the men who kept the American army moving, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this kind of history find the people who still care about it. Now here is what makes that truck at Thalepta strange. The army that built it was, that same week, in worse shape than its enemies would ever have believed. 3 weeks earlier, the American ordnance officer for the whole of the Second Corps, Colonel Urban Niblo, had sat down and written to his superior in the rear. He needed shop trucks, 3 for welding, 8 for tank work, 8 for automotive repair, 1 for instrument repair. He had asked before. He had been sent a handful, and some of those had arrived without their equipment inside. At the bottom of the letter, he added a line that anybody who has ever begged a headquarters for anything will recognize. There were not enough red stars or red stripes, he wrote, for him to put on it. That is the man who owned the truck the Germans were now walking around. His situation, in numbers. Of the trucks in the Tebessa region, 95% needed repair to some degree. Thousands of them had been driven more than 15,000 miles without proper servicing at any level. The parts bins of the company doing his automotive work were almost empty. His mechanics were keeping the fleet alive by cutting up wrecks and using the pieces. One of his company commanders, Captain Joseph Montgomery, reported afterwards that 3/4 of the jobs his men completed were possible only because they had been given permission to strip other vehicles for parts. So hold both pictures in your head at once, because you will need them. A German soldier at Thalepta, opening a set of doors and finding an American workshop so complete that it looked as though a factory had been folded up and driven to Africa. And 40 miles to the west, the American officer responsible for that truck, writing letters to beg for 8 more like it. Both of those things were true on the same day. The distance between them is the entire story. and within 4 days, a German officer of considerably higher rank than anyone standing on that airfield would drive through the American wreckage himself, look at the same equipment, and write down a single observation about what he saw. It was not about the lathe either. That sentence would sit in his papers, acted on by nobody, until his own army had lost the war for precisely the reason his sentence had already named. By the 22nd of February 1943, Erwin Rommel had already decided the Kasserine offensive was finished. He drove the ground anyway. North up the Kasserine road, then west toward Tebessa, over country his own columns had taken and the Americans had given up. There was no enemy left to look at. What there was, for mile after mile, was American equipment. Burned hulks, trucks nosed into ditches, half-tracks abandoned with their doors hanging open, crates, tires, tools. Rommel had been at war for 4 years by then, in Poland, in France, across the whole of North Africa. He had walked over more captured equipment than almost any commander alive. And when he wrote about that drive afterwards, he did not write about American tanks, which he considered nothing special. He did not write about American gunnery, though his own panzer crews had been badly frightened by it days earlier. He called the Americans fantastically well-equipped. And then he wrote a second thing, and the second thing is what matters. He wrote that the Germans had a great deal to learn from the Americans in the way they organized themselves. And he named the single feature that struck him hardest. American vehicles and American spare parts were standardized. Read that again, because it is one of the strangest sentences a field marshal ever wrote about an enemy. Rommel is not admiring their weapons. He is admiring their filing system. Now, why would a man like that, in the middle of a campaign he was losing, stop and write down something so unglamorous? Because he had spent 3 years watching his own army take the opposite road, and he knew exactly what it cost. Picture a German workshop company somewhere behind Tunis in that same month. A mechanic has a truck up on blocks and needs a brake cylinder. The question he has to answer first is not whether there is a brake cylinder in stock. The question is, which brake cylinder? Because before the war, German and Austrian and Czech factories between them had put more than 100 different types of truck into service. And those trucks used more than 100 different types of starter, more than 200 different generators, over 100 different brake cylinders, and, this is the detail I want you to sit with, more than 260 different types of light bulb. 260 kinds of light bulb in one army. They knew. That is the part people miss. The Germans had seen the problem coming and had tried to fix it. A program had been drawn up before the war to cut the truck types down to 19, and it came into force on the 1st of January, 1940. Remember that date. It will come back, and it will not come back the way you expect. Meanwhile, on the American side of the line, nobody was congratulating anybody. The man who had just taken over ordnance for the American Second Corps, a lieutenant colonel named John Medeiros, inherited a set of books that would have made most officers ask for a transfer. Between the 21st of January and the 21st of February, his corps had lost 183 tanks, 194 half-tracks, 122 pieces of self-propelled artillery, 86 field guns, 213 machine guns, 512 trucks and jeeps. For some of those items, the losses in a single month were larger than the entire stock held in the American supply bases behind him. Not larger than what he could get, larger than what existed on that side of the ocean. And the standardization that Rommel had just admired in a captured truck? On paper it was real. In practice, in February of 1943, it was barely working. Here is what was actually arriving from the United States. Spare parts came forward in boxed lots, each lot supposedly holding enough parts to keep 100 vehicles running for a year. It sounds like exactly the system Rommel thought he was looking at. It was not. The boxes were packed by men who had never fixed a truck in a Tunisian wadi, and they came stuffed with the wrong things. What the front actually burned through was the dull stuff: spark plugs, nuts, bolts, headlight bulbs, tire patches, carburetors. Those ran out in weeks. The clearest example is engines. Each boxed lot for 100 vehicles contained 18 replacement engines. Experience in Tunisia showed the real figure needed was closer to 30. So mechanics stood over dead trucks with a catalog that told them precisely which engine they needed, precisely what its number was, and no engine. That is the true state of the American miracle in February of 1943. A beautiful index and empty shelves. So Medeiros did something that was not in Field Manual 9-10 and was not in anybody else's manual either. He looked at the battlefield the Germans had just walked away from, still carpeted with American and German wreckage, and he decided that the United States Army needed a kind of unit it did not possess and had never trained. What he built out of that idea would eventually make German tank crews stop trusting their own kill reports. On the night of the 23rd of March, 1943, near a date palm oasis in southern Tunisia called El Guitar, an American battery of 90mm guns was shot to pieces by German artillery. 6 guns, prime movers, fire control gear, all of it torn up and lying in the open, in ground that was still being fought over. The men who came for it arrived at 5 in the afternoon and worked through the dark. Wreckers, riggers, welders, drivers. They crawled the position first with mine detectors, because the Germans salted their wreckage with booby traps and had a particular fondness for putting them under things a man would naturally want to lift. They worked in blackout. They carried rifles because there was nobody else to protect them. By 6 the next morning, the entire battery was on trucks and moving west. It reached an ordnance maintenance company that same day. By 4 o'clock the following afternoon, every gun was back in action. Stop and count that. A battery smashed by shell fire in the evening was firing again inside 48 hours. Not replaced, repaired. The same guns, with the same numbers stenciled on them. Now here is the thing you would never guess from watching it happen. The unit that did that work did not exist in the United States Army. Not on any table of organization, not in any manual, not in anybody's plan. Colonel Medeiros had invented it a few weeks earlier and called it, for lack of anything better, a provisional ordnance collecting company. He built it by robbing his own repair shops. He took the wreckers, the riggers, the welders, the men who could handle a tank transporter, and pulled them out of maintenance companies that were already short-handed, and put them in one outfit whose only job was to go forward onto ground the fighting had just left and bring back everything they could carry. American, German, Italian, anything. That decision cost him. Every man in that collecting company was a man not turning a wrench on a truck that needed him. He did it anyway. Why? Because the doctrine meant to handle this had collapsed on contact with reality. The book said combat troops would clear their own battlefield and hand the wreckage to quartermaster troops, who would send it rearward until it found its way back to whoever had issued it. Anyone who has been in a fight sees the flaw immediately. Men who have just survived a battle do not have the time or the 10-ton wreckers to go collect scrap. So the wreckage stayed where it fell, and every day it stayed there, it was picked over, shot up again, or simply taken by the other side. And the other side was very good at this. That is the part of the story Americans usually leave out. Back in January, on the northern Tunisian front, officers of the 1st Armored Division had noticed something about German tanks that unsettled them. When a panzer was knocked out, it did not stay knocked out on the field. Within hours it was gone, towed off by another tank or dragged away by a purpose-built recovery vehicle, back to a German workshop where men who knew what they were doing would take it apart and make it live again. The Americans were watching the enemy quietly harvesting his own dead machines, and they had almost no way to answer it. One senior American ordnance officer admitted afterwards, in as many words, that on the question of tank recovery, they had all been caught asleep. The British were ahead of them too. At Kasserine, while the Americans were losing tanks they could not drag out, a British repair unit with a heavy tractor called the Scammell pulled 68 damaged tanks off that battlefield and saved them. 68 tanks. From the battle America remembers as its worst defeat of the war. Somebody was out there in the dark, hooking cables to them, so the Americans went and got the tools. Back in the United States, the Ordnance Department had already bolted a crane onto a medium tank hull and called it a recovery vehicle. And by March, the first of them were on ships. In early March, at the base section in Oran, the Army organized something it had never had before: a tank transporter company. 60 trailers, enough in one movement to pick up an entire battalion of medium tanks, plus 6 spares, and carry them hundreds of miles without wearing out a single track. And now put the two halves together, because this is the moment the shape of the thing appears. Recovery without spare parts is just a scrapyard. Spare parts without recovery is a warehouse full of components for tanks nobody can reach. The bins in that truck at Thalepte and the wreckers crawling El Guitar at midnight were not 2 stories. They were one machine, and in the spring of 1943, the Americans were still assembling it in the field, under fire, out of whatever they had. Then the campaign in Africa ended, and the Americans went back over 3,000 square miles of ground they had fought across twice, with trucks, and started counting what they found. The number they came back with tells you exactly what kind of war this was about to become. In the last week of April 1943, while the final battle for Tunisia was still going on to the north, an American ordnance battalion stayed behind at Gafsa to do a job nobody wanted. They were to clear the battlefield. All of it. 3,000 square miles of desert and mountain that 2 armies had fought across twice, littered with ammunition, tanks, gasoline cans, clothing, and scrap in quantities nobody had estimated. Here is what they hauled out of that ground. 20,544 long tons. More than half of it was ammunition. 2,117 tons of it was motor vehicle parts. And in the salvage yard at Tebessa, where the wrecked vehicles were dragged and taken apart, men stripping dead trucks reclaimed over $200,000 worth of usable components. $200,000 in 1943 money, pulled out of scrap by men with wrenches. Now I want you to see why that number is not a housekeeping detail, because this is the moment the story turns. A generator pulled off a burned-out truck outside Spatla went into a bin, and that bin went onto a ship, and that generator was later bolted into a truck in Sicily. It fit. It fit because it was not a generator. It was a specific part with a specific number, and every truck in the United States Army that needed that number took that part, without filing, without shimming, without a machinist adjusting it by hand. Which means the battlefield itself had just become a supply depot. That is the second layer of what the Germans were looking at in the back of that truck at Thalepte, and it is bigger than the first. Standardization is not only about repairing things faster. Standardization means every wrecked vehicle you own and every wrecked vehicle you can reach is a warehouse. Now run the same arithmetic on the German side of the line. A German workshop finds a burned-out truck. Before anything can be salvaged, somebody has to work out which of 100-odd types it is, and whether its generator will serve any other vehicle in that unit. Often the answer is no, so the wreck stays a wreck. The same battlefield that was feeding the American army was, for the German army, a field full of dead metal. And the Americans were not only harvesting their own. In April of 1943, one of the first American Ordnance Technical Intelligence teams reached the front in Tunisia under a captain named George Bennett. His job was to get his hands on German equipment and find out how it worked. And what he wanted most was a Tiger. The British had knocked one out in January. Bennett got hold of one and then had to solve the problem of moving 60 tons of German tank across North Africa and into the hold of a ship, with no heavy tank handling equipment anywhere in the theater. He did it with 2 enlisted men and a block and tackle he rigged himself. That Tiger went to the United States. Engineers took it apart, measured its armor, tested its gun, and put what they learned into American design. So hold these two pictures side by side, because the whole answer lives in the space between them. A German soldier at Thalepta opens an American truck, sees standardized parts and a numbered catalog, and reports it. A field marshal drives the same ground, sees the same thing, and writes it down in his own papers. These people standardize their vehicles and their spare parts, and we have a great deal to learn from them. An American captain gets his hands on a Tiger and ships it 3,000 miles home, and the Army changes what it builds. Both armies captured the other's answer. Only one of them did anything with it. Why? Hold that question. We are going to answer it, and the answer is not that the Germans were stupid, because they were not. And it is not that they never tried, because they did try. And I told you their attempt came into force on the 1st of January, 1940. That date is going to come back. But first, follow the Americans out of Africa. The men who had learned all this went to Sicily, and then to England, and one of them carried a peculiar obsession with him. Colonel Medeiros, planning ordnance support for the invasion of France, began requisitioning welding rod. Not tanks, not guns, welding rod, and oxygen and acetylene cylinders to burn it with, in quantities that struck the supply agencies in Britain as absurd. He was asked to justify it. He kept asking. He eventually cleaned out every depot in the United Kingdom of welding rod and arranged to have production increased, and he carried every pound of it he could across the channel. He could not tell them what it was for. He only knew, from Tunisia, that sooner or later supply would fail his mechanics at exactly the wrong moment, and his men would have to manufacture their way out of it. In July of 1944, that horde of welding rod would decide whether an entire American offensive could begin on schedule, and it would come down to a single week. By the middle of July 1944, the American First Army in Normandy had been fighting for 17 days to advance 7 miles, and it had cost about 40,000 casualties. The reason was hedges. Not garden hedges, earth banks up to 10 feet high, with trees and roots grown solid through them, one around every small field, thousands of them, each hiding anything from a sniper to an anti-tank gun. And tanks could not get through. A Sherman trying to cross a hedgerow had to climb it, and climbing it lifted the nose and exposed the thin belly plate to whatever was waiting on the other side. So the tanks waited for engineers to blow gaps with explosive, and while they waited, infantry died in the fields. The man who solved it was a sergeant. Curtis Cullen, of a light tank reconnaissance squadron, had the idea. An officer in the squadron's own maintenance unit, Lieutenant Steve Litton, built it. It was a heavy iron fork with 5 straight prongs, welded to the front of a tank. And when the tank drove at the bank, the prongs bit into the matted roots, and the tank went through the hedgerow instead of over it. Nose down, belly covered, guns still pointing where they needed to point. And now the detail that I think is the finest single thing in this entire story. They did not have iron to make the prongs from, so Litton used the steel the Germans had planted off the invasion beaches. Those angle iron obstacles, the tetrahedrons, the ones designed to rip the bottoms out of American landing craft on the 6th of June. American mechanics cut them up and welded them onto American tanks. The Atlantic Wall was turned into a tool for getting past the Atlantic Wall's defenders. Think about what you now know about that. In Tunisia, the battlefield had become a parts depot. In Normandy, the enemy's fortifications became American equipment. It is the same idea, one level up. There was a demonstration. General Bradley came to watch, and so did Colonel Medeiros. The fork went through the bank, and Bradley gave an order on the spot. Put these on as many tanks as possible before the breakout. The breakout was Operation Cobra, and it was less than a week away. So Medeiros did what he had learned to do in Africa. He pooled welders and skilled mechanics from his maintenance companies into one mass production crew. He sent his tank transporters, the great slow trailers built to carry medium tanks, down to the invasion beaches to collect German beach obstacles by the load. And then he came to the item that decided the whole thing: welding material. You have been carrying that detail since the last part. Every pound of welding rod in the depots of the United Kingdom, requisitioned by an officer who could not explain to the supply agencies why he wanted so much of it, hauled across the channel, sitting in Normandy doing nothing. It was there. And because it was there, this was possible at all. There was no time now to order welding rod from anywhere. A decision made months earlier in England, for reasons nobody else understood, was the only thing standing between Bradley's order and a shrug. There was one more scare. The evening Madaris flew back to England to secure the last of the rod, somebody discovered a sudden shortage of oxygen and acetylene cylinders, without which the rod is useless. Those cylinders were scarce in Britain. They were found overnight, put on aircraft, and delivered to Normandy before breakfast the next morning. That particular piece of work had an audience. Montgomery's chief of staff, Major General Sir Francis de Guingamp, happened to be visiting Bradley's headquarters, and he watched the whole thing happen. A British staff officer of the very highest experience, watching Americans conjure a scarce industrial commodity out of another country overnight, and being astonished by it. In 48 hours, American ordnance men made close to 300 hedgerow cutters. Within a week, 3 out of every 5 tanks going into the breakthrough had one welded to the nose. Cobra jumped off on the 25th of July. 5 days later, the Americans had Coutances and Avranches, and the gate into central France was open. I want to be careful here, because this is where a story like this can turn into a fairy tale. The cutters did not win the campaign. The bombing did enormous work. So did the infantry, in the worst possible ground, at a price you have already heard. But notice what the cutter actually proves. It was invented by a sergeant, engineered by a lieutenant in a maintenance shop, made from enemy scrap, mass-produced in 2 days by mechanics who had learned mass improvisation in the Tunisian desert. And it existed because of a hunch about welding rod. Not one part of that came from a factory in Detroit. And while those men were welding German steel onto American tanks, something was happening inside German industry that made Rommel's one-sentence observation permanently impossible to act on. It was not an engineering problem. The Germans had better engineers than almost anyone. It was a decision, made at the top, about what a factory should be rewarded for building. Now the date I told you to remember. The 1st of January, 1940. That is the day the German program to standardize their vehicles came into force. Truck types to be cut from more than 100 down to 19. Everything the Americans were doing, the Germans had written down and ordered it before the Americans were in the war at all. Look at that date again. September 1939, Poland. April, Norway. May, France. The standardization order took effect in the same winter the Wehrmacht was preparing to conquer Western Europe. And here is the trap, and it is worth understanding, because it is the kind of trap that catches competent people. To standardize, a factory has to stop and retool. Stopping means fewer vehicles this month in exchange for a repairable army next year. A country already at war cannot make that trade, because next year is a theory and this month is real. Then victory made it worse. Every conquest handed Germany another country's vehicle fleet. French trucks, Czech trucks, Italian, Belgian, Dutch, later Soviet. All of it pressed into service, because a running truck is a running truck. So the German army's vehicle park did not get simpler as the war went on. It got wilder, and it got wilder precisely because they were winning. By the time Rommel stood in the Tunisian debris writing that these Americans standardized their parts, his own army was hauling supplies in vehicles built in half a dozen countries to no common measure at all. And then, on top of that, came the decision that finished it. German industry, under pressure from the top, was told to build tanks. Output of new hulls was what a factory was measured on. Spare parts were not. So the plants turned out fresh Panthers while, in the field, hundreds of Panthers already delivered sat motionless, waiting on some small component nobody was being rewarded for manufacturing. By 1944, some panzer divisions had fewer tanks running than tanks waiting for repair. Now let me put a man in that. A German tank commander, somewhere in France, in the summer of 1944, has a Panther with a failed final drive. Not a hit, nothing burning, a mechanical fault, entirely repairable, on a machine worth more than the houses in the village behind him. The workshop cannot get the part. The recovery vehicle is elsewhere or broken. The order comes to withdraw. So he sets a demolition charge inside his own tank and walks away. That was not a rare event. When historians have gone through the hard data on Panther losses in the campaigns where the records survive, the majority were not tanks destroyed by enemy fire. They were tanks the Germans blew up or abandoned themselves, machines that had either never been hit at all or had damage that could have been repaired if there had been time, parts, and a way to drag them out. The Germans understood this too, and they tried to answer it. They built a recovery vehicle out of a Panther hull, which was sound thinking, but it inherited the Panther's drivetrain, and there are German records of recovery vehicles breaking down on the way to recover something else, and they never had enough of them. Total production of that recovery vehicle across the entire war ran to a few hundred. The Americans, by contrast, had organized whole companies of tank transporters with 60 trailers apiece. Now put an American machine next to that German commander walking away from his Panther. In November of 1944, in France, a Sherman was knocked out in action. Damaged, out of the fight, a write-off in any army that could not fix it. American ordnance recovered it, repaired it, and reissued it to a crew. On the 26th of December, that same tank, named Cobra King, commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, was the first American tank to break through into Bastogne and reach the men who had been surrounded there for a week. The tank that broke the siege of Bastogne was a repaired casualty. Sit with the pair of them for a second. Same war, same winter, roughly the same distance from a factory. One army writes off an undamaged tank because it cannot get a part. The other army takes a tank the enemy already killed once and sends it in to relieve a surrounded division. Nothing separates those two outcomes except a numbered part in a stenciled bin and an organization built to go out and drag the dead machine home. This is what the Germans were actually looking at in the back of that truck at Thilepte in February of 1943. Not a workshop. A different definition of the word destroyed. And that definition can be measured. The American armored divisions kept ledgers, and one of those ledgers contains a number so strange that when you first read it, you assume it is a misprint. It is not a misprint. And it is the reason German kill reports, meticulously compiled by honest officers who really had knocked those tanks out, stopped corresponding to anything happening on the battlefield in front of them. In 1943, American intelligence in the North African theater wrote up an inventory of what German photographic units in that theater were actually carrying. It is one of the least dramatic documents of the war, and I think one of the most revealing. 2 types of camera. That was all. For motion pictures, an Arriflex with 1 medium telephoto lens. No high-power telephoto lenses at all. And for stills, a Leica, used exclusively, with a single 50mm lens. No telephoto lenses with these. 1 film stock, Superpan, for everything, packed in 30-meter rolls for the cine cameras and 36 exposure lengths for the Leicas. Unless you have used a camera, you may not feel what that means, so let me put it plainly. A 50mm lens sees roughly what your eye sees. It is a beautiful lens for a soldier's face, a tank commander in a hatch, a column moving past you on a road. It is very nearly useless for a battle, because a battle happens a mile away, and at a mile, a 50mm lens gives you a landscape with some smoke in it. So a German propaganda cameraman could photograph men. He could not photograph evidence. To get a picture, he had to be close enough to see faces, which is exactly where you stand if your job is to produce an emotion, and exactly the wrong place if your job is to record where the enemy's guns are. And before anyone objects, this is not German industry being backward. It was the opposite. German optics were the best in the world, and American photographers said so. They loved captured Leicas and Rolleiflexes, bought them where they could, and used them in preference to their own issue equipment. So the finest cameras on Earth were pointed at faces, because the system that issued them wanted faces. Now look at what the Americans did with the same problem. This is where it snaps into focus. In April of 1943, straight out of the Tunisian fighting, an American general wrote back to Washington with a demand. 35mm cameras had to be as rugged as a Leica or a Contax, and telephoto lenses were absolutely necessary to get anything worthwhile from a battlefield, because modern war meant armored formations maneuvering at distance. That is not a photographer talking. That is a soldier saying, "I cannot see the enemy. Send me something that lets me see the enemy." And they did not wait for Washington. In the 12th Army Group, a technical sergeant working as a shop foreman built, by hand, an adapter that let a 21-inch lens be fitted to either an IMO or a Leica. 21 inches, 10 times the reach of what the Germans had in Africa. He took it out to the Lorient and Saint-Nazaire sector, and the pictures that came back showed roadblocks and gun emplacements that American intelligence officers did not know existed. Stop on that. A sergeant in a repair shop improvises a lens mount, and enemy positions appear on a map for the first time. That is the entire thesis of this story, compressed into one man with a file and a piece of aluminium tubing. A camera built for propaganda cannot do reconnaissance. A camera built for reconnaissance can do propaganda whenever you want it to. That same sergeant also built a rain and mud shield for the front of the speed graphics, and ground down a plate inside the movie cameras because his photographers complained the film was picking up scratches. Look at the culture in that. Issue tripods weighed 8 to 18 pounds, so a cameraman built one out of aluminium tubing that weighed 2. Another made a camera handle from the casing of a parachute flare. Men waterproofed Leicas in ration bags. Nobody asked permission because their job was not to deliver an approved image. Their job was to bring back what was there. Now put the numbers on it. By the 1st of April 1945, there were around 200 American cameramen working the European front alone, and they had produced 55,000 stills and 2.5 million feet of motion picture film. 200 men with telephoto lenses feeding a machine that turned what they saw into what the next division was taught. And now go back to February of 1943 and Rommel's verdict on the American soldier. Inexperienced, badly led, clumsy. 10 days after Patton took over, at El Guitar, American troops stopped a German armored attack cold, and German assessments of the Americans began to shift. And they kept shifting, because the army they had measured at Kasserine kept ceasing to exist and being replaced by a better one every few months. That is what they were actually fighting, not braver men, a faster loop. There is one image left. Norman Hatch, in the water at Batio, made a single frame that no other cameraman in the entire Pacific War managed to make. What is in it is the last thing I have to show you. Here is the frame. Batio, the 20th of November, 1943. In the foreground, Marines firing. In the background, in the same shot, Japanese soldiers running for cover. Both sides, alive, in one image. It is believed to be the only time in the entire Pacific War that American servicemen and enemy troops appear together in the same piece of combat film. Hatch estimated he was about 30 or 40 feet from the enemy when he made it. He said afterwards that he did not know why he was not hit, and I want you to understand what that frame required. To stand where he stood, a man had to be close enough to be killed, and he had to accept that when the moment came, he would be winding a camera instead of raising a rifle. Those Marines shouting at him in the water were not being unkind. They were being sane. In their world, A man who could not shoot back was a man who was going to die for nothing. He was not going to die for nothing. That frame, and the 76 hours around it, went back to Hawaii and into full-size replicas of Japanese seawalls, into the founding of the underwater demolition teams, into waterproofed radios and longer bombardments, and 1,000 small corrections to the way the next landing was made. Men who never knew his name, on beaches he never saw, walked ashore easier because he stood in that water with a camera. That is the answer to the question we started with, and it is simple enough to say in one sentence. The Americans filmed their own mistakes because their film belonged to the men who still had to fight. The Germans could not, because theirs belonged to the men who had to be believed. One army was studying itself, the other was performing. And over 4 years, that difference compounded, the way small differences do, until it stopped being a difference in film policy and became a difference in armies. And the reason no German unit ever dared is not that German soldiers lacked nerve. It is that in their system, there was nobody to show it to. A film of a German attack breaking down had no destination. There was no combat lessons pamphlet waiting to print it, no training camp waiting to screen it. No chief of staff sitting in the dark asking what has to change. It could only ever be an embarrassment, so it was never made. Now what happened to them? Lloyd Friedendahl went home and spent the war training soldiers, retired in 1946 and died in 1962. David Shoup, who warned about that reef and did not get enough Amtraks, received the Medal of Honor for Tarawa, and rose to become Commandant of the Marine Corps. John Huston was decorated, promoted to Major, and went back to Hollywood. San Pietro was entered into the National Film Registry in 1991. His last wartime film, about soldiers with shell shock, was suppressed for 35 years, which tells you the loop was still imperfect, and that it was people, not machinery, who kept forcing it open. Larry Mueller's camera is still at the bottom of the Kasserine River, and Norman Hatch went on to Iwo Jima, became Chief Photographic Officer of the 5th Marine Division, and filmed what was left of Nagasaki. He left the Marine Corps in 1946 as a major, and then he did something that I think closes this story better than anything else could. He went to work for the Department of Defense as a civilian, and stayed for 34 years, ending as Chief of the Audiovisual Division for the Assistant Secretary of Defense. And for 15 of those years, he was the Senior Audiovisual Advisor to the Secretary of Defense himself. Think about that. The kid who waded onto the reef at Baisio with a hand-wound camera and no rifle spent the rest of his working life making sure the United States kept looking at itself. He died on the 22nd of April, 2017, at 96 years old, and he is buried at Arlington. The Marines in that water asked him why he was there without a weapon. He told them, quietly, that he had to be. He was right, and it took the rest of the century to see how right he was. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this one. If it gave you something you did not have before, a like helps, because it tells the platform this kind of history is worth putting in front of people. And stories like Hatch's are easy to lose. Subscribe and turn on the bell if you want the next one. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle wore an American or Allied uniform in the Second World War, tell me his name and what he did. I read them, and so do a lot of other people here.